And tonight we are delighted to have Greg Castillo to give one of the Friday lecture. It's pretty exceptional. He's an associate professor at UC Berkeley, working on architectural history. He worked a lot on the Cold War, and is now working on counterculture, which is a great topic, I think, for this place. So thank you very much for giving a talk tonight.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And this is about a 45 to 50-minute talk, so there'll be some time for questions and comments at the end. So I'm starting with this slide. A little over a year ago, just in time to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the San Francisco 1967 Summer of Love, I served as guest curator of Hippie Modernism, The Struggle for Utopia, as it was installed at the UC Berkeley Art Museum. I'm an architectural historian, not a trained curator, so my learning curve was steep. I edited down an exhibition originally created for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and then added hundreds of locally sourced items to really flesh out the story of a distinctive regional origin of the counterculture movement, which had, of course, global repercussions. I approached the show as a kind of public history project. I wanted to re-examine a culture that's often remembered through dismissive stereotypes. So we all know the stereotypes of the stone tree hugger, flower power child, and so forth. One of the things that was kind of a brilliant move by the original curator of the show, Andrew Blauvelt, was to conjoin these two words, hippie and modernism. They're two words that you almost never will see together. This exhibition title was intended as a provocation to challenge viewers to re-examine and to reevaluate counterculture aesthetic practices. So critics objected to the show's title because they said hippies, after all, embraced tribal communality and do-it-yourself craft. How could they be considered an aesthetic avant-garde in any way related to modernism? And they were, of course, thinking of machine-age modernism. Now let's see if this little baby's going to work. Let's see, does that do it? Yes. Machine-age modernism and hippie modernism approached what it meant to be human in an age of industrial modernity very differently. And that's depicted in these two images. One is a 1926 German poster representing the human body as factory processes, and the other is a 1967 human being poster from San Francisco. They both depict alternative ways in which modernity could be quite literally embodied. Bauhaus modernism's man-machine interface consistently privileged the machine. Its celebration of the assembly line is reflected in this depiction of the human body as an industrial object, perfectly attuned to social engineering utopias. By contrast, the hippie body was an outlaw zone. It defied mechanistic analysis. Hippie modernism transgressed cultural geographies and violated fixed categories, those of high and low tech, modern and primitive. Its holistic worldview was a do-it-yourself blend of global philosophies and traditions infused with LSD, a modern pharmaceutical product, and set to the rhythm of wailing guitars and strobe lights, two more novel post-war technologies. Oops, maybe this one? Okay, so in going beyond media stereotypes to reassess hippie cultural production, I'm focusing on the work of the counterculture's so-called outlaw builders. And I'll start by considering how the San Francisco Bay Area emerged as a modern incubator of 60s counterculture. We'll then examine some of the cultural and spatial strategies that defined Bay Area counterculture, particularly self-production as a self-fashioning practice, an ideal that's at the core of hippie DIY, do-it-yourself production. We'll also touch upon Bay Area alternative publishing as a crucial self-fashioning tactic that disseminated new practices and which assembled an alternative public sphere, much as social media does today. Finally, I'll trace the transatlantic transfers and reassessments of counterculture self-build practices as they bounced between Europe and America. So let's start right here where we are now, San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. It was the site that incubated hippie culture, and that district is outlined here. Now, is this? Yeah. So here's the Haight-Ashbury, and we're like right around here somewhere. Cole, no, right around there. So the Haight runs the length of the linear park called the Panhandle, which even you visitors from London hopefully have seen by now. And the Panhandle runs, of course, from Golden Gate Park all the way toward downtown, so between the Pacific Ocean and downtown. From the late 1930s onward, this elegant residential corridor, that's what it was originally, succumbed to disrepair and disinvestment after being redlined. Redlining was a racist banking practice, practiced between the late 1930s and the late 1970s when it was made illegal. And it defined high-risk lending zones for banks based on black residency, and it eliminated the financing needed to purchase or renovate properties. Post-war planners considered this district ripe for urban renewal. They proposed a new elevated highway through the Panhandle that was supposed to link downtown San Francisco with another highway unbuilt that was supposed to run along the Pacific coast. So this stacked freeway, which was thankfully unbuilt, and you see a cross-section of it here running right through the Panhandle, would have really drowned the Haight in noise and pollution. The prospect of urban renewal was another disincentive for maintaining older housing. Landlords thought, why not just hold on to rundown rental buildings until they were purchased for demolition or could be sold for redevelopment. Fortunately, this freeway plan was derailed by San Francisco's so-called Great Freeway Revolt. This was America's first successful grassroots obstruction of post-war highway building. Meanwhile, with its depressed values and cheap rents, the Haight became a residential alternative to North Beach, which in the early 60s was San Francisco's established bohemian neighborhood. A new urban subculture took root, squatting in large Victorian homes earmarked for demolition, or by renting them for live-work projects like that of the Grateful Dead communal household, which you see over here. By the mid-1960s, the Haight had devised a community with a tribal character, both in its communal residences, its shared cultural enthusiasms, but also its use of LSD as a rite of passage and initiation. Hippie counterculture is actually unimaginable without the catalyst of lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, acid for short. Albert Hofmann, a pharmaceutical chemist at Switzerland's Sandoz Labs, first synthesized LSD in 1938. While handling the drug some years later, he accidentally dosed himself, probably by touching his eye. He discovered not only the hallucinogenic effects of LSD, but also its athenogenic properties, which created an experience of being connected to a holistic cosmic order. By 1947, Sandoz began to market the synthetic drug for experimental psychiatric use. In the early 1950s, the CIA's Project MKUltra began testing LSD on human subjects, often illegally, as a potential mind control weapon. Testing was done through several front organizations in the Bay Area, including the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital, where Ken Kesey, a Stanford creative student writing student, worked as a night aide. Kesey, on the lower right-hand side of the screen, volunteered as a test subject, and the rest is history. The mind-blowing experience informed Kesey's 1962 best-selling novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. LSD, which was still legal throughout the US, actually until October 1966, quickly escaped its laboratory quarantine. In 1964, Kesey used his book royalties to fund a psychedelic bus trip from San Francisco to New York, accompanied by a commune called the Merry Pranksters. Their cross-country journey reversed the trajectory of America's pioneer settlers by going from west to east. The pranksters were unsettlers who promoted their LSD gospel from sea to shining sea. Returning to California, Kesey hosted the acid-infused happenings he called acid tests. He advanced plans to scale up the acid tests as a novel kind of urban carnival, enlisting his friends in the project. And of course, for you AA students, this is exactly a kind of event that coalesced new communities. 3 festivities marked the consecration of a novel collectivity grounded on acid experience. The Trips Festival, held in January 1966 at San Francisco's Longshoreman Hall, was the initial Big Bang event. The Love Pageant Rally, 9 months later, which took place literally 2 blocks from here, you see it here, protested the criminalization of LSD use, and an accompanying manifesto asserted the inalienable right, quote, to the freedom of the body, the pursuit of joy, and the expansion of consciousness, ironically on the very day that their chemical catalyst, LSD, became a felony punishable by a 1 to 3 year prison term. At the rally, hundreds of celebrants downed an LSD dose in jubilant protest. The Human Being, on the right, of January 1967, promoted as a gathering of the tribes, proposed the unification of San Francisco's cultural radicals with Berkeley's political activists. The event also marked a transmission of authority from tribal elders, including the beat poet Gary Snyder, to hippie successors like Timothy Leary. You see both of them on the screen there. Let's see, where's Snyder? Gary Snyder is an outdoorsman, Timothy Leary, and we'll have a little bit more to say about both of those figures in a moment. Held in Golden Gate Park, the Human Being unexpectedly drew about 30,000 participants. It dropped jaws of news anchors all over America, and while all these events can be considered progenitors of the outdoor rock concert, they were something quite different. Nor can the LSD used at these events be reductively categorized as a party drug in contemporary terms. LSD exerted a lively agency at these gatherings, bringing to mind actor network theory and Jane Bennett's conception of vibrant matter. In expanding the possibilities of human consciousness and reinvention, psychedelics prompted an uncanny revision of post-war modernity. In rupturing the suffocating confines of post-war progress, as imagined by the American middle class, hippies flung themselves into unfathomed, extemporized futures. Sensationalist reporting on San Francisco's Aquarian transformation flooded the hate with new hippie converts, runaway teens, drug dealers, and sexual predators. As LSD supplies dwindled during the Summer of Love, heroin and speed made rapid inroads. New arrivals burdened free food programs, clinics, and other support services beyond capacity. As the Summer of Love degenerated, many hate tribal veterans decamped for greener pastures, including in Berkeley, but also the Back to the Land movement. The open land ideology of the Morning Star commune in nearby Marin County drew hundreds of novice settlers attracted by the promise of self-reinvention and communion with nature. The result was anything but pastoral. Rural neighbors, repelled by naked bodies and transgressive behaviors, begged authorities to shut the carnival down. A band of Morning Star stalwarts established a more isolated outpost at Wheeler's Ranch, a second open-land commune that served as a finishing school for disciples of the Back to the Land movement, the largest founding of new intentional communities in American history. For this discussion of hippie sorry, I missed a panel here. Okay. Life on an open land settlement demanded self-production skills that few new converts possessed. At the Houseboat Summit, convened by the Hate's underground newspaper, The Oracle, to discuss counterculture futures, Gary Snyder confronted Timothy Leary with the dilemma of his LSD-inspired directive to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Quote, according to Snyder, "Your dropout line is fine, but what I want to hear is what you're building. What are you making? Like, you can't just go out and grow vegetables, man. You have to learn how to do it." A torrent of manifestos addressed the new possibilities of hippie self-invention. The flowering of Bay Area alternative publishing has become equated with its greatest hit, which you see here, Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, but the phenomenon of self-publishing was much broader in both output and impact. Decades before desktop publishing, hippies pioneered the use of newly available, user-friendly equipment like the IBM Selectric Composer and Polaroid MP3 halftone camera to generate justified copies, shoot halftone images, and create camera-ready paste-ups. A new materialist or object-oriented ontology would add these graphic arts devices to pharmaceutical LSD as the non-human actants that exerted their agency in hippie self-fashioning practices. All were included in the access to tools promised by Brand's catalog, which was originally devised as a reference catalog for Back to the Land pioneers. Brand's Whole Earth catalog is too often treated as the default value of counterculture history and has bolstered teleological readings of the rise of Silicon Valley and cyber capitalism. So there's a kind of a narrative out there that puts this catalog, the Whole Earth catalog, and Apple computers on a direct line. The real story is much more complicated. So for this discussion of hippie self-crafting, I'll look instead at the relatively neglected work of Alicia Bay Laurel, born Alicia Kaufman. Joan Didion's essay, Alicia and the Underground Press, notes her skill as a 17-year-old journalist. Alicia walked away from her privileged background after being committed to an insane asylum when her mother discovered she used LSD. Involuntarily incarcerated as a minor, she secured her release as an 18-year-old adult and fled north from LA. After a brief stint as a San Francisco State art student, Alicia joined the hippie urban exodus to outdoor life at Wheeler's Ranch. Once there, she changed her last name and resolved to solve the problem of clueless communards with a pen and a sheaf of blank typing paper. To orient urban newcomers, she began to compile an illustrated guide for rural self-invention. Stripped of chapter headings, it leads readers through, quote, an unmapped land, from traveling the wilds to the first fence, simple housing, furnishing houses, crafts, agriculture, food preparation, medicine, not unlike the development of our ancient ancestors, end quote. Titled Living on the Earth, her hippie Bildungsreise, or Journey of Self-Discovery, assaults American consumer culture with the wide-eyed wonder of an ingenue. Panels devoted to making a Mexican peasant blouse, or, on the right, elegant unbaked confections, are vulnerable to a misreading as mere hippie repackaging of repressive gender conventions, rather than the short-lived phenomenon that counterculture scholar Gretchen Lemke calls difference-based feminism. The potted plant on the right, pun intended, provides a clue to the active ingredient in Alicia's Moroccan surprise dessert. Incidentally, panels on massage and how to get rid of pubic lice flout middle-class conventions and illustrate the broadened scope of relations found among human and non-human communards at Wheeler's Ranch. How-to instructions on hunting and butchering wild game, curing pelts, and making shoes provide DIY skills not usually found among kids raised in West LA, like Alicia was. In fact, the practices of self-invention inventoried on Living on the Earth were crowdsourced. In researching her self-help manual for open land acolytes, Alicia interviewed Wheeler's Ranch residents to compile a master list of useful skills and best practices. Panels on childbirth and forced cremation celebrate alpha and omega moments of Alicia's manifesto, making explicit the panoramic breadth of this utopian vision of anarchic self-production. Living on the Earth, which taught readers how to, quote, dig a proper shithole and to live under a tarp, earned Alicia Bay Laurel a 1971 Woman of the Year award from the fashion merchandising journal Mademoiselle. It was an indication of how the book's mass marketing by the New York publishing giant Random House had sanitized the anarchism of Alicia's handmade call to arms. Living on the Earth includes an evolutionary narrative of do-it-yourself architecture. It begins with tent making and progresses to wooden shelters as informed by commune building experience. Quote, cheap lumber, buy from a wrecker or work at a wrecker yourself, as a wrecker yourself. Buy lumber mill ends, lumber seconds, she writes. Alicia's tips on how to scrounge and scavenge building materials for post-war primitive huts advanced not only low-cost DIY construction, but also reinforced the ideology of free a term of incantatory, even ritual portent for the counterculture. Hippie freedom meant escaping the bondage of capitalist economic transactions, which rewarded wage slavery with consumer affluence. The ideology called voluntary primitivism, advanced by Wheeler's Ranch communard Ramon Byron Sender, who happened to be Alicia's lover, escaped the binary affluence or poverty notion through a lateral move. If America's productive overcapacity caused cosmetically impaired produce, out-of-fashion clothing, and leftover construction materials to be treated as trash, it also could serve as a supply chain for an Eden of permissive austerity. Building types that seemed like hippie fantasies reflected building experiments conducted at Wheeler's Ranch. Alicia writes, quote, "If you live on land that has been raped, that is logged, you may find stumps that work as foundations for your house." Her recipe for a forest nest seems like an acid dream, but accurately describes an outlaw dwelling called the Chapel, created by communards at Wheeler's Ranch. A structure missing, however, from Wheeler's Ranch open land commune was the geodesic dome, architectural history's own hippie commune stereotype. To a certain extent, America's first hippies were responsible for the notion that Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome was a signature counterculture building type. During the 1960s, Buckminster Fuller traversed the U.S., giving lectures that promoted his visionary worldview. He framed design in terms of engineering, philosophy, and human psychology. A lecture that Fuller gave in 1965 at the University of Colorado provided the inspiration for Drop City, an artist commune, seen at the top and the right, which is often thought to be America's first hippie commune. Captivated by Fuller's talk, Clark Reichert and his fellow droppers cobbled together a geodesic shantytown from scavenged materials, including lumber scraps, factory reject plywood, tar paper, chicken wire, and junkyard car roofs. In celebrating the hippie infatuation with geodesics, we architectural historians have often missed Fuller's more enduring counterculture contribution, namely his spatial beliefs about innovation, quote, in the outlaw area, unquote, as his 1966 New Yorker interview was titled. Fuller's notion of the outlaw area emerged from an idiosyncratic, that is his own, origin myth about technology. Fuller claimed that early civilizations produced technological breakthroughs only upon taking to the open sea, because this was an outlaw area that imposed challenges in a zone unregulated by land-based laws and covenants. Sailors became, in Fuller's words, world men, and lawlessness begat weaponry, but also ultimately advanced the technology of what Fuller called livingry. Fuller awarded Drop City his 1967 Dymaxion Award for its mad riffs on geodesic geometry. And that Drop City legacy can be seen at the bottom in the 1999 Henry Ford Museum in Detroit installation titled Communal Living in a Geodesic Dome 1973. A cage of metal dome struts frames a cast iron stove, thrift store furniture, and the obligatory fern in its macrame hanger. The display was intended to advance Henry Ford's goal in founding a museum to, quote, reproduce American life as lived as the best way of preserving its history and traditions. However, a crucial detail completely betrays Ford's mission statement. Metal dome struts, milled and joined with a jeweler's precision, violate the culture of scavenging embraced by both hippies and their dropper avant-garde that you see on the right. In his essay entitled Funk Architecture, Drop City builder Bill Voigt argued that building from scrap was no less important than the dome it produced. A 1967 Dropper manifesto proclaimed, quote, we have discovered a new art form, creative scrounging. We are sort of advanced junkmen taking advantage of advanced obsolescence. Voigt insisted that, quote, trapped inside a waste economy, man finds an identity as a consumer. But learning how to, quote, tear down abandoned buildings, use the unusable, the garbage of America, end quote, produced an alternate identity. Creative scrounging launched a journey of self-reinvention. Ultimately, the dream of building a new world from the consumer waste of the old could not be reconciled with Fuller's domes. They demanded precise tolerances, and when built from scrap, they leaked from dozens of seams. That bad news was broadcast by an unlikely but impeccable source, Lloyd Kahn, the editor of the shelter section of Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, and subsequently, with his colleague Bob Easton, the co-author and editor of Dome Books 1 and 2. These were the prime resources for hippie builders. You see Kahn and Easton in the photo on the lower right. Easton has a baby in his lap. Kahn is diagonally opposite. With his book revenues, Kahn built a dome home in Bolinas, featured in Life magazine. In 1972, with Dome Book 2, a bestseller, Kahn took a fateful hike in a Marin forest accompanied by a hit of mescaline. He hallucinated a geodesic dome in a lovely glade. But as the fantasy vision raced forward in time, the dome became a hideous canker sore of delaminating plywood and yellowed plexiglass. Horrified by his bad trip, Kahn called his publisher and pulled his bestseller from bookstore shelves at the height of sales in order, in his own words, not to have any more domes on my karma. Dome Books co-editor Bob Easton helped Kahn find an alternative self-built paradigm. Easton, a Berkeley graduate, argued that Fuller's dome was not architecture at all, but actually an industrial design invention, something that Kahn understood, having paid a hefty licensing fee just to publish Fuller's patented diagrams and dome book. Easton's argument had far-reaching implications. It reputed an entire vector of modernism dating back to the 1920s, when Walter Gropius turned the Bauhaus away from craft expressionism and instead toward mass production and machine culture. In Dome Book 2, Kahn had stated, quote, "The only growing resource is trash." In contrast, industrial modernism from Gropius to Fuller demanded technologically advanced first-use building materials. Hippies needed a paradigm for architectural production located further downstream in the flow of resource consumption, and Easton knew exactly where to find it. The 1964 catalog for the New York Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Architecture Without Architects, had made the rounds of architecture schools at the time, including Berkeley's. Easton was deeply impressed by its global kaleidoscope of low-tech vernacular housing. A manifesto conveyed in images rather than text, Architecture Without Architects held special promise for hippie builders attempting to bypass their geodesic dead end. Shelter, Kahn's dome book replacement,